Welcome, weary traveler of the night, to another quiet voyage through the corridors of history. For generations, the authentic inheritance of King Arthur has not merely faded, but has been intentionally veiled. What we are uncovering now is a startling and long-suppressed connection between Arthur's bloodline and the elusive Knights Templar. This is not idle speculation. It is a carefully examined disclosure that challenges how we understand a concealed past and how that past continues to shape the present moment. The narrative opens with a subtle disquiet that has steadily grown in recent times, an intuition that something very old is shifting beneath the refined surface of familiar legend. In the year 2025, global attention has once again turned toward the ancient king. Filmmakers recast him as a sanctified warrior. Scholars release studies on overlooked hill forts. Forgotten manuscripts resurface from neglected shelves in dim archives. Even contemporary genetic research quietly suggests irregularities within early British family lines. Taken together, these elements form a modern fixation that feels oddly synchronized, almost as though history itself is pressing against us, asking us to re-examine a story we assumed was settled. The Arthur commonly handed down to us today, the virtuous ruler, the radiant court of Camelot, the round table symbolizing equal brotherhood, is not the Arthur who existed amid the mud, violence, and instability of the post-Roman age. The version we carry is polished, reassuring, and heroic, a narrative that comforts by design. Yet when one moves slowly through the centuries, allowing each historical layer to fall away like aging paint, an unease begins to surface. Early chroniclers often contradict one another without explanation. Lineages are abruptly altered or disappear altogether. References to Arthur surface suddenly, without context, only to vanish for generations, as if an inconvenient thread had been pulled too sharply and then hastily concealed. The sense that this story has been deliberately shaped grows stronger the deeper one travels into the fog of early history. Even in the oldest Welsh poetry, Arthur is not presented as a purely fictional sovereign, but as a commanding force who inspired awe, loyalty, and fear. He appears as a military leader, certainly, but also as someone bound to something far more unusual: prophecy, ceremony, and ancient authority. There is an untamed quality in these early sources, an echo of sacred kingship that mirrors royal traditions later erased across parts of continental Europe. When examining how subsequent writers softened his image, transforming a turbulent and mystical ruler into a refined ideal of courtly virtue, one begins to sense an unseen influence, a shaping presence refining the legend for acceptable audiences. It is this unseen influence that pulls us further inward. The suspicion grows that Arthur's story once contained something far more unsettling than myth alone, a core too dangerous to endure the rise of orthodox monarchies. That danger may have revolved around bloodlines, succession, and inheritance. Themes that, like other erased traditions on the continent, were intentionally muted until only a safe legend remained. Yet history never seals itself completely. In forgotten poems, neglected genealogies, and half-preserved records, a quiet vibration remains. It hints that behind the Arthur, we recognize exists another figure entirely. Gradually, scholars have begun to notice that this vibration does not exist in isolation. It aligns with another cadence, a distant resonance from the Middle Ages, belonging to an order of warrior monks whose shadow still lingers in historical memory. The Knights Templar and the Arthurian myth are rarely examined together, yet both share striking patterns: abrupt ascents, unexplained silences, and an undercurrent of forbidden inheritance. As modern interest intensifies, these two narratives appear to draw closer, as though drawn together by truths long obscured, but now returning to view. It is along this convergence that we now proceed. We begin tracing the faint but persistent thread linking Arthur's obscured legacy with the most guarded ambitions of the Templars, a thread that, once perceived, cannot be ignored. Legends do not endure for centuries without cause, and often that cause is not storytelling. but survival itself. Camelot is frequently imagined as a serene vision, sunlit halls, gleaming armor, and banners flowing in a warm breeze. For centuries, it has served as a refuge of honor, chivalry, and moral certainty. Yet narratives this pristine seldom grow from untouched ground. When the layers of romantic medieval verse, careful embellishment, and gentle reinterpretation are stripped away, another Arthur takes shape. This version is more complex, more vulnerable, and far more unsettling to the authorities who later defined European history. The earliest references to Arthur depict not a ceremonial king of splendor, but a hardened war leader, possibly a federated commander, struggling to maintain order amid the collapse of Roman Britain. The land was divided, tribal, and haunted by the retreat of imperial legions. Within this fractured world, the Arthur of early record appears formidable, uncanny, and deeply connected to rites predating Christianity. Nothing about this figure aligns with the benevolent ruler portrayed in later chronicles. His legend feels sharpened, unstable, as though carrying a force that later scribes felt compelled to restrain. And over time, something distinctly revealing begins to unfold. Those chroniclers who once portrayed Arthur as a blazing, near otherworldly force gradually began to reshape him into a moral ideal, a ruler presented as virtuous, balanced, and reassuringly stable. The sharp edges were slowly worn down. Conflict softened, battles lost their clarity, supporting figures multiplied. Wonders became allegories, and through this steady refinement, the darker and more unsettling currents beneath his tale quietly slipped away. What endured was a neat and orderly account, almost excessively so, one that reads less like preserved memory and more like an intentional framework designed to instruct and comfort. This carefully assembled Arthurian realm, constructed layer by layer across generations, became a refuge for the imagination. Yet beneath its elegance rests an uneasy realization. Camelot begins to feel less like a historical record and more like a veil, a deliberate rearrangement of symbols meant to conceal an origin too controversial or perhaps too sacred to be stated openly. For decades, scholars have pointed out irregularities within the genealogies connected to Arthur. Sudden omissions appear. Conflicting claims emerge. Foreign bloodlines are introduced without explanation. Some rulers eagerly attempted to bind themselves to his name, while others avoided the association entirely, as if sensing peril in the connection. These are not the traces of evolving folklore. They resemble revisions. Even more striking is the silence surrounding Arthur's heirs. In most royal records, lineage flows onward with pride, generation after generation. Arthur's line, however, abruptly halts, dissolves, or is replaced with abstract language describing the close of a golden age. That absence mirrors a familiar pattern of erasure seen in the Maravanian records, where sacred rulers claiming divine descent became inconvenient to established doctrine and were quietly removed from collective memory. When narratives of sacred origin threaten an authorized version of the past, they are rarely debated. They are simply rewritten. Thus, the Camelot passed down to us, cherished and luminous, may not reflect the Camelot that once existed. It may function instead as a covering placed over something far older, more complex, and deeply political. A story refined again and again until its true inheritance faded into harmless legend, safe for public embrace. If the reality of Arthur's bloodline carried a force capable of unsettling medieval power structures, then transforming it into myth was not merely artistic choice. It was calculation. Here, the maze grows deeper. The more closely we study the polished surface of Camelot, the more clearly we sense the outline of something concealed just beyond its light, a truth lingering in the narrow passageways between myth and record. And as our attention turns toward those shadows, another figure begins to take shape at the margins of the narrative. An order formed centuries later, bound by vows of humility and authority, whose concealed history continues to ripple through time like the wake of unseen vessels, the Knights Templar. Before long, their trajectory will intersect with Arthur's in ways that unsettle nearly everything we believe we know. When one moves carefully through the earliest centuries of British history, allowing texts to speak and silences to stretch, a strange transformation occurs. Arthur's story, which should read plainly if it were nothing more than legend, starts to resemble a document altered repeatedly by cautious hands. Passages appear smoothed, seams tighten where fraying should exist. Then, almost unnoticed at first, a single loose strand emerges. It begins with minor contradictions. A battle placed in one region reappears in another account far away. One list of rulers mentions Arthur in passing, while another positions him as the central pillar of the age. His companions shift. Names are softened, removed, or introduced anew. Women of influence, once prominent in early Welsh tradition, slowly retreat into the background. Even Arthur's origins become unstable, sliding across generations and tribal lines in a manner no ordinary genealogy would permit. It is as if someone sought to anchor him, yet never in the same place twice. This degree of instability exceeds normal historical drift. It reflects the pattern of a narrative deliberately reshaped, its original structure buried beneath layers of careful alteration. Often, the strongest clues appear not in what is written, but in what is omitted. Entire spans of time pass where Arthur disappears from record, only to return with altered qualities, new settings, and sometimes entirely new ancestry. The pattern mirrors the unsettling erasures seen in the histories of the Merovingians, those sacred rulers whose bloodlines were removed so thoroughly that their descendants seem to fade into nothingness. Another anomaly surfaces within medieval genealogical charts. Certain family trees that once stretched proudly into the distant past suddenly end when they approach Arthur. A handful of noble houses initially claimed descent from him, then later abandoned the assertion without explanation, as though quietly cautioned away. In some manuscripts, names are struck through, rewritten, or replaced with vague designations such as the rightful heir or the chosen line. Phrases suggesting importance beyond simple legend. These are not the flourishes of storytellers amplifying a hero. They are the marks of editors attempting to dim the glow of something once immensely significant. Even geography behaves strangely. Locations long linked with Arthurian memory, hill forts, ancient burial sites, ritual clearings, appear in early sources as sacred or forbidden places. Later accounts reduce them to ordinary battlefields or romantic scenery. Archaeological evidence reveals layers of ritual use, offerings, and stone structures far older than Arthur's era, implying that these sites belong to spiritual traditions predating the legends by centuries. Yet medieval chroniclers largely avoid this dimension. They minimize the rituals, strip away symbolism, and convert sacred ground into mere stages for chivalric exploits. It is as though every element that made Arthur dangerous, every aspect that carried spiritual weight, political consequence, or ancestral authority was carefully pushed away from his image. What remains is a noble ruler, yes, but one curiously detached from the earth that formed him. And it is only when we begin pulling at that single loose thread, those removed names, those silenced roots, that the entire tapestry begins, almost imperceptibly, to shift. Beneath the ornate and carefully stitched image of Camelot rests a design of inheritance that was never intended for ordinary sight. When a lineage carries genuine power, the kind capable of unsettling institutions, history does not confront it openly. History conceals it. And as we move further along this path, the outline of a very different force begins to stretch across the fading trace of Arthur's story, a force defined by secrecy, guardianship, and the discovery, and sometimes the burial, of truths deemed too dangerous to endure exposure. The Knights Templar wait just beyond the next turn of the narrative, Their arrival into history was quiet, almost modest. 9 knights, bound by vows, sworn to protect pilgrims traveling a single hazardous road leading into Jerusalem. Yet within only a few decades, they rose into one of the most formidable, feared, and enigmatic institutions the medieval world had ever known. Their ascent feels unnatural, as though propelled by influences beyond the reach of ordinary military orders. As their presence expands across European chronicles, it begins to brush against the unresolved ambiguities within Arthur's story, like a hand extending across centuries. The Knights Templar were not merely soldiers. They represented an anomaly, a brotherhood of warrior monks who defied medieval expectations by accumulating influence at a pace that unsettled both kings and popes. They controlled wealth without claiming ownership, governed land without ruling it, and possessed secrets without revealing them. Their commanderies operated as vaults, treasuries, and places of refuge. Their ceremonies, conducted behind iron doors and by candlelight, remained cloaked in rumor and conjecture. As their power deepened, they seemed to carve a parallel course through history, quiet, independent, and increasingly feared. Even more intriguing is the context of their rise. They emerged during a period when the medieval world was desperate for relics, ancestry, and evidence of divine authority. The Holy Land was more than a battlefield. It was a reservoir of contested memory, layered with ancient ruins, forgotten texts, sealed chambers, and unexplored passages. These were not simply sacred places, they were repositories of power. The Templars placed themselves at the very heart of this terrain, establishing their headquarters on the Temple Mount, a site saturated with symbolism, conflict, and lingering whispers of the past. For years, they excavated beneath the mount in ways that still provoke suspicion centuries later. No official records describe construction. No explanations were offered. There was only silence, followed by sudden and inexplicable prosperity. What they uncovered remains unknown. Some suggest sacred relics, others point to lost gospels. More unsettling theories propose that they found records of lineage, genealogies capable of destabilizing the authority of the church itself, if revealed. It was during this prolonged and secretive excavation that the nature of the order began to transform. Their wealth expanded rapidly. Their architecture evolved, adopting geometric forms that some scholars associate with cosmologies belonging to older, suppressed belief systems. Their internal hierarchy grew denser, layered with vows and knowledge forbidden to outsiders. Through every shift, their purpose appeared unwavering: secrecy, guardianship, and the protection of something unseen. At this point, the Templars move beyond historical curiosity. Their archives, travel routes, and alliances reveal a persistent and unusual focus on Britain, far exceeding any requirement of their military obligations. They acquired land in regions associated with ancient kings. They established commanderies along paths linked to Celtic royal traditions. They maintained discreet relationships with families whose genealogies preserved fragments of long-forgotten claims that echo the same obscured thread woven through Arthur's disrupted lineage. This convergence is not coincidental. The same pattern of redaction that clouds Arthur's origins appears again in the centuries that connect the Templars' rise and destruction. Just as the Maravenian kings were erased when their bloodline threatened the church's narrative, the Templars faced annihilation once their secrets began to challenge the authority of both crown and papacy. Their fall was swift, violent, and wrapped in accusations too theatrical to be fully believed, yet too persistent to dismiss. Something about the Templars terrified the medieval world more deeply than their riches or influence ever could. They guarded something. They knew something. And whatever it was carried implications that stretched backward into Britain's mist-covered past. The story of the Templars does not merely ascend through history. It converges. And as we follow that convergence further, we begin to glimpse what the Templars themselves may have suspected. That the Arthurian legend, far from being an isolated myth, may represent one of the earliest indicators of a bloodline powerful enough to reshape the course of Christendom itself. The narrative now carries us to a place where stone remembers more than any chronicle dared to preserve: the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. In the earliest years of the Templar Order, long before their banners crowned European strongholds, the entire Brotherhood operated from this single ancient platform. Beneath it, in hollow chambers older than recorded history, something occurred that transformed a small band of warrior monks into a force capable of rivaling kings. The Templars' occupation of the Temple Mount has often been treated as a minor detail in popular accounts, yet it is in truth the central axis of their mystery. They arrived in Jerusalem with no wealth, no authority, and no resources beyond their vows, their resolve, and the blessing of a king. Yet within 9 years, their fortunes shifted so dramatically that historians have struggled to explain the transformation without resorting to speculation. Those 9 years align precisely with the period during which the Knights are believed, according to multiple accounts, to have conducted secret excavations beneath the mount. The work was never officially sanctioned, never publicly recorded, and never explained. The tunnels they explored were not remnants of recent conflict, but labyrinths reaching back to the First Temple, the Babylonian destruction, the Hasmonean dynasty, and even deeper layers whose markings remain unreadable. Whatever they sought, they pursued it carefully, methodically, and without interruption. Then, just as suddenly as the digging began, it ended. The Templars emerged from those hidden depths transformed, wealthier, more assured, and bound to a secrecy that would define the remainder of their existence. Across medieval Europe, rumors spread with remarkable speed. Some claimed the Knights had uncovered sacred relics, fragments of the Ark of the Covenant, holy vessels, or lost scrolls thought vanished forever. Others whispered of a suppressed gospel, buried by early Christians, one that could unravel the Church's authority if ever brought into the open. Yet alongside these louder speculations existed another idea, quieter but far more unsettling, that the Templars had discovered proof of a bloodline, not symbolic, not allegorical, but biological. A lineage stretching back to the earliest followers of Christ, perhaps even to Christ himself. It is here that distant echoes of Britain begin to surface. In certain apocryphal traditions, long erased by ecclesiastical scribes, Britain was not a remote edge of the Roman world, but a refuge, a land where displaced families, early believers, and persecuted lineages sought safety. Among these whispered migrations lies the belief that a sacred bloodline traveled west, crossing Gaul, passing over the Channel, and taking root among the tribal elites of early Britain. Over generations, fragments of this lineage merged with Celtic royalty, eventually reappearing in genealogies surrounding a war leader whose memory refused to fade: Arthur. If the Templars uncovered genealogical records, scrolls, or even burial remains tracing such a lineage or confirming its survival, the consequences would have been profoundly destabilizing. A living bloodline hidden within Britain would challenge not only the legitimacy of kings, but the foundations of theology itself. The Church's authority rested upon apostolic succession, not biological descent. A rival divine lineage would have been nothing short of catastrophic. Perhaps this is why Templar symbols begin to appear in places seemingly disconnected from their crusading mission. Remote chapels in Wales, concealed shrines in Cornwall, discreet holdings near ancient hill forts, long linked with Arthurian memory. Their presence forms a silent constellation across Britain, each site selected with a precision that suggests intention rather than chance. And yet, the Templars never declared that intention. They left no written explanations, only mute maps, cryptic seals, and architectural designs shaped by sacred geometry, mirroring patterns found at sites rumored to hold Britain's oldest royal graves. The message is unmistakable. Britain mattered to them, deeply, intimately, and perhaps dangerously. If the excavations beneath Jerusalem revealed knowledge, evidence of a sacred bloodline, then Britain may have been the place where that bloodline endured. And the Templars, newly empowered and resolute, may have positioned themselves as either its hidden protectors or its silent wardens. Whatever they uncovered beneath the Temple Mount did more than enrich them. It altered their destiny. It set them on an inevitable collision course with kings and popes alike, drawing them steadily toward a lineage woven into Britain's mist-laden past, one that may have been hiding in plain sight since the age of Arthur. Had the Knights Templar confined their influence to the Holy Land, their story would have remained extraordinary yet contained. But as their power radiated outward, an unusual pattern emerged, one that historians continue to struggle to explain. Across continental Europe, Templar commanderies appeared in expected places, along trade routes, fertile plains, and river crossings. Yet when their expansion reached Britain, their choices shifted. Locations became strangely deliberate, almost symbolic, as though guided by something beyond strategy or military necessity. Templar sites in Britain form another quiet constellation, clustering not around economic centers, but around regions steeped in ancient legend. Wales, the West Country, the Welsh Marches, lands long associated with Arthurian memory and Celtic royal bloodlines. Rather than prioritizing England's wealthy eastern shires, the order established preceptories near forgotten hill forts, burial mounds, and places where early genealogies hinted at something older than medieval nobility. These acquisitions were not random. Someone within the order was selecting sites with an almost archaeological instinct, aligning the Templar presence with landscapes carrying echoes of pre-Christian rites and ancestral kingship. In the Welsh Marches, one preceptory stands strikingly out of place. It lies within walking distance of a mound traditionally linked to Uther Pendragon, a figure often dismissed as myth, yet whose name appears with unsettling persistence in early annals. Another Templar holding rests near a region where medieval poets claimed Arthur was conceived, not through romance, but through ritual. Deeper still in Cornwall, a quiet, abandoned chapel contains carvings that merge Templar crosses with knotwork motifs associated with Britain's most ancient families. None of these placements make sense unless the Templars were pursuing something beyond land or wealth. The British Crown appears to have recognized this unusual focus. Records indicate that early Plantagenet kings granted the Templars privileges in territories tied to legendary Celtic dynasties, lands they themselves struggled to control. In exchange, the Templars provided counsel, financial support, and something far less tangible, legitimacy. A subtle but revealing pattern appears in royal charters of the period. Moments where a monarch's fragile claim to territory or ancestry is quietly reinforced through Templar backing, as though the order possessed knowledge capable of strengthening or undermining dynastic narratives at will. Then there are the genealogical manuscripts. A small number survive today, though most show signs of alteration, redaction, or inconsistent copying. These texts trace certain British bloodlines back through obscure tribal kings to a semi-mythic figure whose characteristics mirror the earliest portrayals of Arthur. A warrior touched by prophecy, a ruler born between worlds. In margins barely visible, symbols resembling Templar seals appear, as if a monk knight once stood beside the scribe, guiding or correcting the lineage. One genealogy ends abruptly after referencing a sacred descent from the Western Isles, echoing the same pattern of erasure seen in suppressed dynasties across continental Europe, most notably the Moravians. Scholars have identified yet another irregularity. In regions where the Templars concentrated their holdings, local folklore itself began to shift. Accounts of wandering holy men, slumbering kings, and concealed heirs began to multiply, as if the presence of the order awakened something ancient and half-remembered. In certain villages, oral memory speaks of knights clad in white mantles, arriving not to levy taxes or drill soldiers, but to seek. They questioned elders about forgotten graves, cavern shrines, and family lines preserved only through song. At times, they offered generous payment in exchange for silence. At other moments, they raised chapels above places locals warned should remain untouched. Whatever they sought, their pursuit was quiet, deliberate, and almost reverent. Less the conduct of conquerors and more the work of archivists, caretakers of a secret too fragile to expose. As their presence deepened, British chronicles began to shift in tone, subtly reviving themes long associated with Arthur's legend: sacred kingship, divine authority, chosen heirs. But now these echoes carried an added mark: the red cross of the Templars, faintly visible like a watermark beneath the ink of medieval history. The pattern points to intention rather than coincidence. The Templars' interest in Britain was not marginal, it was essential. And whatever they believed lay concealed within those mist-laden hills and ancient burial grounds, they pursued it with the resolve of men convinced they were tracing the remnants of a forbidden lineage. In the dim recesses of medieval scriptoria, where quills murmured like restless spirits and candlelight bent across sheets of vellum, scribes sometimes recorded details they should not have known. Unfamiliar names appeared. Lineages broke abruptly. Marginal symbols surfaced, whose meanings hovered uneasily between faith and heresy. These scattered fragments, spread across centuries, form the earliest hints of a genealogy so unsettling that later historians treated it not as scholarship, but as a danger. A lineage that seemed to pulse beneath Britain's oldest myths, lingering at the edge of Arthur's story, like a shadow that never fully resolves. This forbidden ancestry does not exist in any single source. Instead, it emerges in fragments, partially preserved in Welsh triads, obscured within Breton songs, and faintly suggested in early Latin chronicles, where Arthur is described not as a figure of legend, but as a tangible king whose bloodline merited careful record. In one manuscript, a scribe begins a royal genealogy with confidence, tracing backward through tribal kings, chieftains, and warriors, until the line suddenly halts at a name scraped so thin the ink barely survives on the page. Another manuscript mirrors the same break, yet here the scribe has added a note. From him came the most sacred line. The ink appears darker than the surrounding text, as though inserted later, hurriedly or in defiance. It is this emphasis on sacredness, rather than heroism, that draws modern attention. The earliest accounts do not frame Arthur as a romantic invention. They present him as a figure whose ancestry carried weight, whose blood conveyed legitimacy, whose lineage was spoken of in tones that made later chroniclers uneasy. And it is within the gaps where Arthur's recorded descent dissolves that we encounter patterns strikingly similar to those seen in the Merovingian controversies, where French kings, believed to possess divine blood, were quietly erased when their claims threatened ecclesiastical authority. Over time, some medieval genealogists attempted to reconnect the severed threads, reconstructing Arthur's ancestry from scattered oral traditions. Some traced his origins to Romanized Britain. Others linked him to ancient Celtic priest kings. A few ventured further, proposing roots tied to early Christian migrants, refugees who carried teachings, relics, and perhaps something even more consequential from the Eastern Mediterranean. These efforts were repeatedly challenged, mocked, or dismissed by church-sanctioned scholars, not because they lacked plausibility, but because they echoed dangerous parallels between Arthur's lineage and other forbidden bloodlines whispered about throughout medieval Europe. At times, a striking irregularity emerges. A family chart will abruptly connect Arthur's descendants to obscure houses in Wales or Brittany, only for the entry to be crossed out and replaced. Marginal annotations read, "Not permitted," "Uncertain," while the surrounding genealogies remain intact and orderly. One chart associates Arthur's line with a Western star, a symbol that resurfaces centuries later in Templar manuscripts describing their interest in British sacred sites. Another genealogy introduces a woman whose name has been nearly scraped from the parchment, as though her importance was too volatile to be allowed to remain. And then there are the Templar links, faint yet unmistakable. Threads woven so subtly into the record that they appear only to those willing to linger, to look again, and to listen for what history chose not to say aloud. In a small number of surviving records, symbols associated with Templar archivists appear beside names linked to the earliest British dynasties. These markings are not placed next to Crusader families or wealthy benefactors, but beside bloodlines that existed centuries before the Templars themselves. It is as though a learned knight, working late within a shadowed Parisian archive, was carefully retracing an ancient descent, one that intersected with the Order's most closely guarded knowledge. This raises an unsettling possibility. Did the Templars believe that Arthur's lineage contained something sacred, something that demanded protection, or perhaps concealment? Their sudden prosperity following the excavations beneath the Temple Mount, their cryptic movements across Britain, and their persistent attention to genealogies all suggest a quiet fixation on origins, not the origins of nations, but of people, families, and blood. If such a lineage truly existed, if Arthur was not merely a figure shaped by story, but a branch of something far older, then that bloodline would have represented an existential threat to any institution claiming exclusive divine authority. Just as the Moravians, whose rumored descent from Christ destabilized the French Church, provoked suppression, a sacred British lineage would have shaken both medieval theology and royal legitimacy. The forbidden genealogy, then, is not simply a list of names. It is a fault line, one that scribes attempted to obscure, monarchs sought to manipulate, and the Templars may have tried to trace back to its source. A lineage woven with myth, erased through silence, and buried beneath generations of careful revision. As we move deeper into this maze, the central question sharpens. Were the Templars guardians of this lineage, or were they its captors? To reconsider Arthur's ancestry is to step cautiously into a realm where myth and history press so tightly together that the boundary between them dissolves. For centuries, Arthur has been framed as a literary symbol, a nostalgic echo of a lost golden age, rather than a participant in the volatile realities of early medieval Britain. Yet when we return to the oldest layers of his story and strip away the romantic gloss applied by poets, scribes, and later chroniclers, another Arthur begins to emerge, one whose lineage feels less symbolic and far more consequential. In the earliest Welsh sources, Arthur is not the refined ruler of Camelot, but a chieftain of unsettling authority, a leader whose power appears rooted not only in battle, but in birthright. These texts treat ancestry not as decorative detail, but as the foundation of legitimacy itself. They describe lineages infused with prophecy, ritual inheritance, and an aura that borders on the supernatural. Arthur is portrayed as the product of this ancient continuum, a convergence of tribal lines already steeped in sacred significance. It is within this shadowed convergence that we begin to understand why later chroniclers may have felt compelled to reshape his story. If Arthur's bloodline carried echoes of something older, something approaching the sacred descent attributed to suppressed royal lines on the continent, the implications would have extended far beyond Britain. The Church had already confronted the Moravians, whose claims of divine or semi-divine ancestry proved too volatile for the emerging theological order of Europe. A British dynasty bearing similar traits would have been equally dangerous, particularly in a land where Christianity spread unevenly, merging with older traditions and lingering Druidic beliefs. In such a landscape, lineage was not merely heritage, it was power. Imagine, then, a scenario quietly feared by the early medieval Church. A king whose legitimacy did not flow from ecclesiastical blessing, but from ancestral claims rooted deep within Britain's mythic past. A bloodline older than Rome, shaped by both ancient gods and the new faith. Arthur's earliest portrayals, sacred, enigmatic, and prophetic, align too closely with this model to be dismissed. He appears less as a hero of chivalric romance and more as a pivot point in a lineage that fused spiritual and political authority. This perspective helps explain the later sanitization of Arthur's heritage. Genealogies blur his origins, chronicles soften his edges. Medieval writers recast him as a Christian monarch whose authority derives from virtue rather than blood. This transformation feels less like natural literary evolution and more like deliberate containment. The same mechanism used to diminish the Merovingian lineage once its sacred implications became too threatening. Yet fragments of the older Arthur endure. Folklore continues to speak of kings chosen before birth, of dynasties protected by fate, of rulers tied to celestial signs and ancient prophecies. These themes are not inventions of Romance literature. They are remnants of a forgotten model of spiritual kingship that once dominated Britain's imagination. When Arthur is restored to this context, his story takes on a heavier gravity. He becomes a node within a lineage once regarded as holy, not figuratively, but literally. And it is here that the Templars drift back into view. What would an order obsessed with sacred bloodlines, divine inheritance, and hidden genealogies make of a king whose origins had been deliberately obscured? Their movements across Britain, their focus on ancient burial mounds and ancestral lands, and their cryptic symbols appearing in places bound to Arthurian memory, all suggest that they, too, sensed something unresolved beneath the legend. All of this suggests that the Templars may have regarded Arthur not as a figure of legend, but as a key, an individual whose lineage carried threads they had encountered before. Threads they believed were worth following, safeguarding, or perhaps suppressing. To reconsider Arthur's bloodline, then, is not an exercise in imagination. It is an act of recovery, a return to the possibility that beneath the softened legend lay a dynasty whose existence posed theological and political challenges too vast for the medieval world to confront openly. A line that may have extended into the very centuries the Templars navigated with such calculated restraint. As the narrative turns once more, we move closer to the center of this intrigue, toward the question that has lingered in shadow from the beginning. If Arthur's lineage endured, what role did the Templars play in shaping its destiny? If the Order truly uncovered traces of a sacred bloodline, whether in the buried chambers beneath Jerusalem or in the mist-veiled landscapes of Britain, they would have faced a decision of immense consequence. A decision that would shape not only the fate of their brotherhood, but the course of medieval history itself. Were they to protect such a lineage, preserving it as a living remnant of an ancient inheritance? Or were they to control it, ensuring that no rival claim to divine legitimacy could threaten the Church or the political balance upon which Europe precariously rested? This question lingers within every surviving fragment of their story. When the timeline is followed with care, the Templars' meteoric rise acquires a new and unsettling context. Their sudden wealth, their strategic secrecy, their extraordinary independence. These traits may reflect more than military success or papal favor. They may indicate possession of knowledge capable of shaping kingship itself, knowledge that could confer or deny legitimacy, knowledge rooted in blood, ancestry, and the very concept of divine descent. Whether such knowledge originated in their excavations beneath the Temple Mount or through their quiet inquiries across Britain, its implications would have been immense. Consider their behavior on British soil. They did not settle merely where convenience dictated. They positioned themselves like silent sentinels near ancient royal sites, burial mounds, and regions where early genealogies hinted at bloodlines older than medieval kingdoms. Their chapels frequently rose upon pre-Christian foundations. Their commanderies aligned with pathways once associated with sacred kingship. These placements feel deliberate, almost ceremonial, as though the Order were guarding something concealed, not in plain sight, but beneath the earth, beneath the narratives, beneath the weight of centuries. Yet the same pattern can be interpreted in another way. The Templars may have regarded an ancient lineage not as a treasure to preserve, but as a danger to contain. Institutions of power, particularly those bound to ecclesiastical authority, rarely tolerate competing claims. A living bloodline carrying echoes of sacred kingship, especially one tied to figures such as Arthur, or in darker continental whispers, a lineage tracing back to Christ himself, would have destabilized the fragile structure upon which medieval Christendom depended. The fate of the Moravians offers a chilling precedent. Their rumored sacred descent led not to debate, but to erasure, replaced by a dynasty more compliant with church authority. If the Templars encountered a similar lineage in Britain, one capable of undermining the theological monopoly of crown and church, they may have acted not as protectors, but as gatekeepers, custodians of a truth too dangerous to release, preservers of a narrative that maintained their own influence while restricting the resurgence of a forgotten bloodline. The ambiguity deepens when examining the final years of the order. On one hand, the Templars acted with the assurance of a brotherhood convinced of its sacred mission. On the other, they moved with the anxiety of those who knew they held a volatile secret, one that could be wielded against them or used by them with equal consequence. When King Philip IV of France turned against the order, the charges were grotesque, contradictory, and clearly designed to horrify. Yet buried within the coerced confessions extracted under torture are repeated allusions to a truth too great for ordinary men, to a line that endures, to an inheritance concealed. Though unreliable, these fragments echo familiar patterns seen in suppressed dynasties, symbolic, fragmented, and hauntingly persistent. And so we arrive again at the central dilemma. Were the Templars guardians of a sacred bloodline, or custodians of a silence meant to bury it? Perhaps they were both. Perhaps they shielded the lineage from annihilation while simultaneously preventing it from rising to challenge an already fragile order. In doing so, they became something stranger than knights, and more complex than monks. They became keepers of a truth they both honored and feared, an inheritance bound to Arthur's obscured descent, to ancient British kingship, and to whispers extending beyond Britain into the deepest mysteries of Christian tradition. As the story moves forward, we approach the motive behind such secrecy, the reason this lineage, if it truly existed, could never be allowed to surface without reshaping the entire trajectory of European history. If there truly existed a lineage capable of unsettling the medieval world, a bloodline woven into Britain's deepest myths, and perhaps into an even older sacred narrative, then one question becomes unavoidable. Why was it hidden? What force, what fear, what ambition could compel the most powerful institutions of the Middle Ages to bury such a truth beneath centuries of silence? To understand this, we must enter the fragile architecture of medieval authority, a world where kings ruled not only through conquest, but through a carefully constructed claim to divine legitimacy. The Church, in turn, maintained its dominance not with armies, but through the belief that its hierarchy alone served as the bridge between humanity and the sacred. Within such a system, the idea of a hereditary, sacred lineage, one existing independently of Rome's blessing, represented an existential threat. A bloodline rooted not in ecclesiastical approval, but in inheritance, in ancestry older than the Church itself, would undermine the foundations of both throne and altar. This danger was not hypothetical. On the continent, the Moravian kings, long associated with ancient sacred descent, were quietly displaced by the Carolingians. Their rituals, their mystique, and their whispered claims of divine origin proved incompatible with the emerging Orthodox order. Their lineage was dismantled, rewritten, and erased from political memory. If a comparable bloodline existed in Britain, perhaps tied to Arthur's obscured ancestry, the same machinery of suppression would have been ready to act. Seen through this lens, the Templars' sustained interest in Britain takes on a different meaning. Perhaps they were not merely seeking relics or strategic lands. Perhaps they encountered evidence of an inheritance too powerful to ignore. And once such knowledge was grasped, assuming it existed at all, they would have faced a dilemma with no harmless resolution. To reveal a sacred lineage would have fractured the Church's claim to universal authority. It would have empowered regional kingships, challenged Rome's narrative, and destabilized a continent already strained by crusades, plagues, and political fragmentation. A living heir, whether literal or symbolic, connected to an ancient sacred line, could overturn kingdoms overnight. Too many monarchs depended upon papal endorsement. Too many popes relied upon genealogical silence. Yet concealing such a lineage carried dangers of its own. Knowledge, especially knowledge that confers legitimacy, is never easily buried. If the Templars possessed it, they themselves became a liability, a threat, a variable no king or pope could fully control. And as the years passed, their influence expanded financially, politically, and spiritually. They answered neither solely to monarchs, nor entirely to the papacy. They answered to something internal, bound by secrecy and shared understanding. To outsiders, this appeared as arrogance. To those aware of the stakes, it may have appeared as guardianship. Still, guardianship can easily become gatekeeping. If the Templars believed the lineage needed to be preserved from destruction, yet also prevented from asserting its claim, they may have chosen silence over revelation. A path that protected the bloodline while burying it beneath myth. A compromise that maintained the world's fragile equilibrium while holding a truth capable of dismantling it. This tension helps explain the strange duality of the Order's final century. Confident, yet cautious. Powerful, yet hunted. They behaved like men who carried something both precious and dangerous, something kings sought to control and popes feared might surface. When Philip IV of France moved against them, the charges were framed as idolatry and blasphemy. Yet beneath those accusations lay a deeper anxiety, the fear that the Templars possessed knowledge capable of reshaping dynastic legitimacy itself, and when their leaders were burned, that knowledge did not perish with them. It slipped underground, carried in symbols, whispers, altered texts, not destroyed, not forgotten, merely hidden, buried beneath the same silence that once swallowed the Maravenians, and that now stretches like a shadow across the forgotten layers of Arthur's lineage. For if Arthur's bloodline truly existed, and if it carried a sacred inheritance beyond the reach of kings and popes, then its concealment was not simply strategy, it was survival. And as we turn toward the modern era, we begin to see why the resurfacing of such a lineage, after centuries of suppression, could once again shake the foundations of history. When we step out of the dim corridors of medieval silence and into the uncertain brightness of the present, the question that once trembled in shadow begins to take new form. History, even when carefully buried, has a way of re-emerging. Sometimes it rises through archaeological discovery, sometimes through forgotten manuscripts, and sometimes, most unsettling of all, through science, quietly and inexorably unraveling secrets once thought untouchable. In recent years, a constellation of subtle signals has begun to glow at the edges of Arthurian scholarship. Burial sites long dismissed as legend have yielded grave goods, matching descriptions found in early chronicles. Genetic research, still incomplete, yet far more advanced than earlier generations could imagine, has identified unexpected genetic clusters in regions long associated with Arthurian tradition. The Welsh Marches, Cornwall, the Scottish borders. None of this proves that a sacred lineage survived, but it unsettles the tidy narratives constructed over centuries, narratives built upon omission, erasure, and carefully polished myth. And then there are the manuscripts. Digital imaging has begun to expose palimpsests hidden beneath medieval manuscripts, layers of writing scraped away and overwritten, some preserving names that vanished without explanation from genealogical records. Margins once dulled by age now disclose erased markings, stars, crosses, serpentine knots. Some of these symbols correspond closely with insignia found in Templar chapels scattered across Britain. Others mirror motifs linked to pre-Christian traditions of sacred kingship. It is as if the manuscripts themselves are awakening, releasing fragments of a narrative that earlier scribes struggled desperately to suppress. Equally striking are contemporary re-evaluations of Templar archives. Documents once dismissed as forgeries, the imaginative constructions of genealogical enthusiasts or esoteric circles are revealing patterns too coherent to be ignored. Maps long thought decorative show alignments with ancient roots and burial grounds. Heraldic designs, once treated as artistic embellishment, correspond with symbols associated with Arthur's earliest recorded lineages. In the most obscure corners of these archives appear references, vague yet persistent, to a Western lineage, a sleeping heir, and a line that must not rise. These phrases echo another historical silence, one that followed the collapse of the Merovingians, when their alleged sacred bloodline was quietly absorbed, scattered, or erased from official memory. The resemblance is unsettling. A dynasty tied to ancient legitimacy fades from record, replaced by a lineage easier to manage. A similar process seems to hover around Arthur's remembrance. Genealogies fracture. Origins blur. Successors vanish. Yet the modern world no longer resembles medieval Europe. What was once hidden behind cloister walls or papal decrees now faces examination by laboratories, satellites, scholars, and independent researchers who answer to no crown and no church. The tools of the present, genetic sequencing, ground-penetrating radar, high-resolution manuscript imaging, strip away layers once thought unreachable. And with each layer removed, faint yet persistent connections emerge, threads linking Arthur's carefully softened legend to tangible historical lineages. Threads connecting Templar secrecy to their curious concentration around ancient British sites. Threads tying genealogy to the very concept of divine authority. It is therefore unsurprising that discussion of a suppressed lineage, once confined to the margins of speculation, has begun to enter academic conversation, cautiously and quietly, with the same restraint one might use when handling an artifact too fragile, too consequential, too disruptive. Even established historians now concede that the Arthurian narrative contains inconsistencies that exceed ordinary myth-making. They speak of lost layers, fractured genealogies, ideological editing, and phrasing that circles a deeper reality without naming it. Beneath this careful language lies a growing awareness. If a sacred lineage once existed, whether literal or symbolic, its rediscovery would do more than clarify the past. It would reshape the present. It would challenge centuries of theological authority. It would unsettle national identities constructed upon curated histories. It would blur the line between myth and inheritance, between poetic tradition and biological descent. Above all, it would force a reconsideration of Arthur himself, not merely as legend, but as a man whose bloodline may have flowed quietly through generations, protected or suppressed by those who feared what it represented. And now, in an age where secrecy has grown increasingly fragile, that lineage, if it survives, stands closer to exposure than at any point since the Templars first traced its shadow across the British landscape. The narrative returns to us, to this moment, to a peculiar convergence of myth, history, and discovery that defines the early 21st century. For centuries, the notion of Arthur's true lineage lingered as a fading echo, muted beneath rewritten chronicles and softened legend. The role of the Templars dissolved into obscurity as well, their archives fragmented, their symbols misunderstood. Today, however, humanity occupies a position no earlier age possessed. We are able to peer through the veil with instruments sharper than any quill, quieter than any monk, and more relentless than any king. Across disciplines, long-buried stories are beginning to stir. Advanced imaging reveals texts scraped away by cautious hands. Archaeologists uncover burial chambers whose contents match descriptions from the earliest Arthurian verse, objects anchoring legend in physical reality. Genetic research raises questions about ancient migrations and isolated bloodlines in regions long associated with Arthur's earliest traditions. None of these findings alone confirms a sacred lineage. Yet together they form a pattern, subtle but persistent, suggesting that the past was never as sealed as medieval chroniclers intended. Even the Knights Templar, long reduced to victims of royal ambition, are now being reconsidered. Their selection of sites, their recurring symbols, and their rigorously maintained secrecy now appear less like the eccentric habits of a military brotherhood, and more like the conduct of a group safeguarding knowledge too powerful to disclose. Their collapse, once explained as the inevitable downfall of an overextended institution, begins instead to resemble a deliberate silencing. An order removed not simply because it held power, but because it possessed understanding. It was never meant to voice. The same pattern that erased the Maravenian kings seems to flicker beneath the fate of the Templars as well. Not merely the stripping away of influence, but the erasure of narrative itself, of memory, of truths that could not coexist with orthodox history. Within this evolving landscape of inquiry, Arthur's story transforms yet again. No longer a pristine vision of Camelot, no longer a chivalric fantasy polished by centuries of retelling. It becomes something far more complex. A convergence of archaeology, suppressed bloodlines, and the lingering traces of an order that may have known precisely what lay hidden beneath Britain's ancient terrain. Arthur's presence feels less mythical and more gravitational, pulling toward itself clusters of evidence that modern scholarship can no longer fully dismiss. Equally striking is the response of the present world. In an era saturated with information, people instinctively sense the weight of this mystery. Something about Arthur feels unresolved. Something about the Templars feels unfinished. Something about Britain's oldest genealogies feels interrupted. These impressions form a quiet vibration beneath contemporary awareness, as if history itself is urging us to pause, to listen more intently, to read what was written between lines now faded by time. The veil is thinning, not through spectacle, but through patience. Each discovery, each reinterpretation, each technological advance removes another layer of concealment. Gradually patterns begin to surface. The silent movements of the Templars across Britain start to align with forgotten family lines. The earliest Arthurian texts begin to read not as fantasy, but as echoes of suppressed inheritance. Medieval revisions begin to resemble acts of fear, moments when certain truths were deemed too potent to be allowed into the open. What lies beyond that thinning veil remains uncertain. It may be nothing more than lost history waiting to be restored. Or it may be something far more consequential. A lineage that once shaped kingship, gave rise to legend, and threatened the fragile framework of medieval authority. A lineage the Templars, at the height of their secretive power, may have traced, guarded, or confined. One thing, however, has become clear. History is no longer willing to remain edited. It resists, it fractures, it murmurs corrections. And within those murmurs, Arthur's name rises again, older, deeper, sharper than the figure adorned with banners and romance. We now stand at the edge of a future where such secrets belong not to kings, monks, or warrior orders, but to anyone willing to listen. The past is stirring. Long-settled narratives are loosening. Truths buried beneath centuries of silence are edging toward illumination. What will surface next remains unknown. And when the fuller truth emerges about Arthur, about the Templars, about the lineage they may have protected or obscured, it may forever change how we understand the history we once believed complete. The mystery does not end with the thinning veil. In many ways, that is where it truly begins. When history resists closure, when narratives refuse to remain sealed, it often signals that what lies beneath is not merely forgotten, but unfinished. Arthur's name, resurfacing again and again across centuries, carries this unfinished quality like an unresolved chord. Not resolved into silence, not concluded by legend, but sustained, and it is precisely this persistence that draws us forward into the next movement of the story. If the earlier age was defined by concealment, by careful editing and strategic silence, the era that follows is marked by tension, a prolonged strain between what is known and what is permitted to be known. After the fall of the Templars, Europe did not suddenly become safer or more stable. Instead, it entered a long season of consolidation. Monarchies strengthened, churches centralized doctrine. Genealogies were standardized, fixed into official lines that could be audited, defended, and enforced. In this process, ambiguity became dangerous. Any lineage that could not be neatly placed within approved frameworks was either absorbed or erased. Arthur's story, already softened into romance, was further transformed during this period. He became less a king with ancestors and more an ideal without descendants. His bloodline faded from discussion entirely, replaced by metaphors of endings and returns. Avalon, the sleeping king, the once and future ruler. These were not neutral poetic choices. They performed a function. They removed Arthur from the present tense of inheritance and placed him safely outside time. A king who would return someday need not trouble anyone today. A lineage that sleeps does not compete. Yet sleep, in myth and in history, is rarely equivalent to death. It implies preservation, continuity beneath stillness. The persistence of Arthurian motifs through later medieval and early modern Europe suggests that while the bloodline was silenced in official records, it remained alive in cultural memory. Ballads, regional folklore, and local traditions continue to whisper of chosen heirs, hidden families, and kings who walked among common people unrecognized. These stories were often dismissed as superstition, but their geographic clustering is telling. They arise most strongly in the same regions where Templar presence had once concentrated, and where genealogical anomalies remained unresolved. As Europe moved into the early modern period, the mechanisms of control evolved, but the underlying fear did not disappear. Reformation fractured religious authority. New churches emerged, yet all inherited the same problem. Legitimacy still mattered. Whether Catholic or Protestant, power required justification, and justification could not tolerate rival sacred claims. In this environment, Arthur's lineage remained dangerous precisely because it could belong to no single institution. It predated them all. A bloodline, rooted in Britain's mythic past, could not be regulated by Rome, nor easily absorbed by emerging national churches. This may explain why Arthur's story continued to be celebrated, but never clarified. He was praised endlessly, yet investigated cautiously. Scholars romanticized him, poets elevated him, monarchs claimed symbolic descent, but no one pursued the question of literal inheritance too closely. The subject remained curiously untouched, as if a boundary had been drawn generations earlier and quietly respected ever since. What is striking is how often moments of renewed interest in Arthur coincide with periods of institutional anxiety. During times of war, plague, dynastic uncertainty, or religious upheaval, Arthur returns to the cultural foreground. He is invoked as unity, stability, destiny, but always as symbol, never as lineage. This repetition suggests a pattern not of coincidence, but of management. Arthur was useful as long as he remained abstract, yet abstraction can only hold for so long. Beneath the surface, records continue to exist. Local archives, private collections, family histories passed down quietly, sometimes disguised as folklore, sometimes encoded in naming traditions or burial practices. These fragments did not announce themselves. They waited, and as centuries passed, the reasons for silence grew less immediate, even as the silence itself endured. By the time the modern age arrived, the structures that once enforced suppression had weakened. Kings no longer ruled by divine right alone. Churches no longer monopolized knowledge. The authority to ask questions had widened. And with that widening came unease. Because questions long avoided began to surface naturally, without conspiracy, without provocation. Scholars noticed inconsistencies not because they sought them, but because the tools to detect them had improved. The gaps became harder to ignore. Arthur, once again, became problematic. Not as legend, but as absence. Why did his genealogy end where others continued? Why did regions associated with him show unusual continuity of certain family names? Why did burial practices in those areas diverge subtly from broader norms? These questions did not assert conclusions. They simply refused to go away. And so the story moves forward, not as revelation, but as pressure. A slow accumulation of unresolved details that strain the old narrative from within. Arthur's bloodline, whether literal or symbolic, begins to reassert itself, not through proclamation, but through pattern, through recurrence, through the quiet alignment of data points that do not fit comfortably inside myth alone. It is here, in this slow tightening of the frame, that the legacy of the Templars becomes relevant once more. Not as knights, not as martyrs, but as precedent. As an example of what happens when an institution stands between power and an uncontainable truth. Their destruction did not erase what they knew. It merely delayed its resurfacing. The first part of this continuation, then, is not about discovery. It is about inevitability. The realization that some histories cannot remain buried forever because they are not inert. They live inside structures, families, landscapes, and symbols. They adapt. They wait. And when the conditions change, they rise again. Not dramatically, but persistently, pressing against the boundaries of what we think is settled. Arthur's story did not end at Camelot. It did not end with the Templars. It did not end with medieval silence. It simply entered another phase of concealment. And as we move forward, that concealment itself becomes the subject. The second movement of this story unfolds not through sudden revelation, but through inheritance of silence itself. Silence, after all, can be transmitted just as carefully as blood. When a truth is deemed too dangerous to surface, it is not only hidden in documents, it is embedded in behavior, in custom, in what families choose not to say and institutions choose not to ask. In this way, the centuries following Arthur's disappearance from recorded lineage did not erase his bloodline. They taught the world how to look away from it. After the medieval period tightened its grip on legitimacy, Britain entered an era where ancestry became increasingly political. The rise of centralized monarchy demanded clean genealogies, uninterrupted successions, and narratives that reinforced stability. Any lineage that could not be placed neatly within royal frameworks became a liability. Arthur's line, already blurred and mythologized, fit uncomfortably into this environment. It was easier, safer, to let him remain a symbol rather than a man with descendants. Yet symbols have roots, and roots leave traces. Across Britain, particularly in regions long associated with Arthurian memory, certain families persisted in ways that defied broader historical trends. Their land tenure remained unusually stable. Their naming conventions repeated archaic forms long after they had vanished elsewhere. Their burial sites clustered around ancient mounds rather than parish churches. None of this alone proves continuity, but together it suggests a quiet resistance to full assimilation. These families did not proclaim sacred descent. They did not challenge the crown. They endured. Endurance, in such contexts, can itself be a strategy. It is here that the idea of a hidden lineage takes on a more practical shape. Not a royal house waiting to reclaim a throne, but a bloodline adapting to survive. One that shed overt symbols of power while retaining internal memory. A lineage that learned from the fate of others, from the Moravians, from the Templars, that visibility invites destruction. Survival requires obscurity. Rather than prophecy of return, it may encode a warning. Not yet, not openly, not until the world changes. In this reading, Arthur does not sleep beneath a hill awaiting resurrection. His line persists quietly, waiting for conditions where existence itself is no longer a threat. As Britain moved through the Tudor and Stuart periods, the pressure intensified. The Reformation shattered religious unity, but it also hardened suspicion. Bloodlines mattered more than ever. Claims to legitimacy were scrutinized relentlessly. Any suggestion of sacred ancestry outside approved frameworks risked accusation of heresy, treason, or worse. In such a climate, a lineage tied to pre-Roman kingship or alternative sacred narratives would have been extraordinarily vulnerable. And so the silence held. Yet even in silence, traces leaked through. Antiquarians in the 17th and 18th centuries began recording local traditions with puzzling consistency. Stories of lands held by ancient right rather than royal grant. Legends of ancestral obligations tied not to monarchs, but to places. Hills, springs, groves. These accounts were catalogued as folklore, safely neutralized by classification. But their repetition across regions once connected to Arthur and the Templars is difficult to dismiss. More telling still is what these stories lack. They rarely speak of conquest, rarely of ambition. Instead, they emphasize stewardship, guardianship, restraint, language that echoes the very posture attributed to the Templars in their later years. As if the concept of protection without possession had migrated from an order into bloodlines. This suggests a continuity not of power, but of responsibility. If a sacred lineage survived, it may have done so by redefining itself. No longer rulers, no longer challengers, but witnesses, bearers of memory rather than claim, emery. In this form, the lineage could persist without provoking institutional response. A threat only if recognized. Invisible if misunderstood. By the time Britain entered the age of empire, the focus shifted outward. Genealogical anxiety turned colonial. Attention moved away from internal myth toward external domination. Arthur became a literary device, a nationalist symbol invoked to justify expansion rather than to question origin. In this displacement, the danger of Arthur's lineage receded further into the background, not resolved, but ignored. Yet ignoring is not the same as ending. As the modern historical discipline emerged, it inherited both the records and the omissions of earlier eras. Scholars worked with what survived, often unaware of what had been deliberately removed. Arthur's story was treated as myth because the evidence demanded it, not realizing that the evidence itself had been shaped by centuries of suppression. Absence was mistaken for invention. Only when methodologies began to change did this assumption weaken. The introduction of interdisciplinary research disrupted the old compartments. Archaeology began to challenge textual authority. Genetics complicated cultural narratives. Digital humanities exposed editorial layers once invisible. Slowly, cautiously, the idea that myth could encode history rather than replace it gained legitimacy. Arthur returned again, not as king, but as problem. Why did myth cluster so persistently around certain sites? Why did those sites show anomalous continuity of use? Why did genealogical silence align so precisely with areas of intense symbolic density? These were not romantic questions. They were structural ones. And structure implies intention. This is where the second part of the story settles. Not on proof, but on pattern. Not on revelation, but on accumulation. The realization that if Arthur's lineage existed, it would not announce itself with banners. It would manifest as continuity without explanation, as stability without visibility, as silence that feels too deliberate to be accidental. The medieval world feared sacred bloodlines because they destabilized authority. The modern world fears them less, but is unsettled by what they imply. That history is not merely written by winners, but edited by survivors. That some truths are not destroyed, only displaced. Arthur's bloodline, if it endured, did not do so in defiance of history, but through adaptation to it. By becoming something history could overlook. And this brings us to the next question, one that shifts the focus from survival to consequence. If such a lineage persisted quietly through centuries, what effect did it have on the world around it? Did it influence events subtly, shape decisions invisibly, or was its only legacy the preservation of itself? To answer that, we must move closer, not to kings or orders, but to moments where history bends unexpectedly, where outcomes seem disproportionate to causes, where silence itself appears to have weight. Across British history, there are periods where power consolidates rapidly, and others where it hesitates, where decisions are delayed, compromises unexpectedly chosen, outcomes softened when harsher measures were possible. Historians often attribute these moments to chance, personality, or political necessity. Yet when examined closely, some of these pauses cluster around regions long associated with Arthurian memory, areas where land was not fully absorbed, where customary law resisted central authority longer than elsewhere, where local elites retained unusual autonomy despite lacking overt power. This does not suggest control, it suggests presence. A hidden lineage, aware of its vulnerability, would not seek dominance. It would value balance. Survival would depend on preventing extremes, on discouraging attention, on ensuring that no single authority gained such absolute control that silence could no longer be maintained. In this light, the idea of Arthur as a once and future king takes on a subtler meaning. Not a ruler who returns to reign, but a stabilizing force that reappears when imbalance threatens collapse. Medieval chroniclers sometimes described Arthur not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. One who arrived when the land was fractured, who imposed order briefly and then withdrew. This pattern echoes again and again in later retellings. Arthur does not found a dynasty that dominates Europe. He intervenes, corrects, and vanishes. If this narrative encodes memory rather than fiction, it may reflect how his lineage understood its role. Not to rule permanently, but to endure and intervene only when survival itself was at stake. This interpretation reframes the question of legacy. The absence of kings claiming direct descent may not indicate extinction. It may indicate intent. Consider how often British history avoids absolute centralization compared to continental models. Even under strong monarchs, power remained fragmented. Nobility, church, and crown checked one another. The system was unstable, yet resilient. Scholars have long debated why Britain resisted certain forms of absolutism that flourished elsewhere. Geography, culture, and tradition are often cited, but tradition itself has origins. And some traditions persist because they serve an unseen purpose. Arthurian mythology, deeply embedded in British identity, consistently emphasizes balance. The Round Table, equality among knights, authority constrained by moral obligation. These ideas did not emerge spontaneously. They reflect an underlying anxiety about concentrated power. If a lineage existed that had learned, through experience or inherited memory, that visibility invites destruction, it would encode its values culturally rather than politically. Culture outlives bloodlines, but bloodlines shape culture before they disappear. As centuries passed, Arthur's presence shifted increasingly into literature. Yet the themes remained consistent. Kingship as burden, power as temporary, legitimacy as conditional. These motifs persisted even as political realities changed. They survived revolutions, reforms, and redefinitions of sovereignty. Something about them resonated too deeply to discard. Meanwhile, Meanwhile, the physical landscape retained its own memory. Ancient sites associated with Arthur were rarely repurposed aggressively. Many remained untouched, respected, even when their original meaning was forgotten. Folklore warned against disturbing certain hills, springs, or ruins. These warnings were dismissed as superstition, yet they functioned effectively as protection. Places remained intact because people feared consequences they could not articulate. This pattern mirrors the Templars' behavior centuries earlier: guarding without explanation, protecting without possession, creating boundaries that others respected without fully understanding why. If the Templars encountered Arthur's lineage and recognized its danger and value, they may have adopted its strategy, or perhaps they recognized that the strategy already existed, that the lineage had learned to survive by becoming invisible. The Templars, as an order, failed because they could not fully disappear. A bloodline could. This distinction matters. Institutions attract scrutiny. Families can vanish into populations. Over generations, identity dilutes, names change, roles shift. What remains is memory encoded indirectly, in ritual, in custom, in local law, in story. The third part of this narrative therefore concerns diffusion, how something sacred becomes ordinary without ceasing to exist, how inheritance can persist without recognition. Arthur's bloodline, if it survived, would have done so by becoming indistinguishable, by surrendering markers of uniqueness while preserving internal continuity. Modern genetics complicates this picture. Bloodlines rarely disappear entirely. They spread, they branch, they dilute. A lineage that once carried significance could now exist across thousands of individuals, none aware of their connection. Sacred inheritance becomes statistical reality. Not one heir, but many carriers. Not a throne, but a distribution. This may explain why modern research produces patterns rather than proofs. Clusters instead of names. Signals instead of signatures. The lineage, if real, is no longer centralized enough to threaten institutions directly. But it still destabilizes narratives that rely on clean origins and clear breaks. And narratives matter. The modern discomfort surrounding Arthur's story is not about belief. It is about implication. If myth encodes lineage, then history is not merely incomplete. It is misclassified. Fiction becomes archive. Legend becomes data. The boundary between storytelling and record collapses. This is deeply unsettling to disciplines built on categorization. Arthur resists categorization. He is too historical for myth, too mythic for history. This liminal status may be intentional, preserved by centuries of careful neglect. A lineage that survives by existing between categories cannot be easily confronted. The third part of this story ends not with answers, but with a realization that if Arthur's bloodline persisted, its greatest achievement was not survival alone, but transformation. It ceased to be a claim and became a condition. It no longer needed recognition to exist. It shaped culture without demanding credit. It influenced outcomes without revealing authorship. And this brings us to a deeper, more difficult question. If such a lineage became diffuse, distributed, hidden within the population itself, then what exactly were the Templars guarding? A family? A record? Or a principle? Perhaps what survived was not merely blood, but an idea tied to blood. A concept of sacred legitimacy, independent of institutions. A reminder that authority can exist without permission. That power can flow from origin rather than appointment. If so, the danger was never a king returning. It was people remembering. That possibility carries us into the fourth part of the story. Because when memory awakens within a population rather than a dynasty, its consequences are no longer medieval. They are modern. Memory, when it shifts from bloodlines to populations, changes its nature. It no longer moves through inheritance alone, but through recognition. Through moments when people sense that a story belongs to them more deeply than they were ever told. This is where Arthur's shadow becomes most unsettling. Not because it points backward, but because it presses forward into the present. When a lineage becomes diffuse, when it spreads quietly through centuries of intermarriage, migration and survival, it loses the shape of a dynasty, but gains something else. Resilience. It no longer depends on a single heir, a single house, or a single claim. Instead, it persists as pattern, as memory encoded in landscape, culture, and instinct. And this may be why Arthur's story refuses to settle. It does not belong to one family, one throne, or one era. It belongs to Britain itself, embedded so deeply that separating myth from inheritance becomes nearly impossible. The medieval world feared such ambiguity because it could not control it. Authority depended on clarity, on knowing who ruled, why they ruled, and by whose permission. A sacred lineage without institutional endorsement threatened that clarity. But the modern world faces a different problem. It struggles not with rival claims to authority, but with the realization that authority itself may have origins older, messier, and more human than previously admitted. Arthur's endurance reflects this tension. Every generation revisits him, reshapes him, reclaims him. Sometimes as a nationalist symbol, sometimes as moral ideal, sometimes as fantasy. Yet beneath each reinterpretation lies the same unresolved core. Who was he, really? And why does his story feel incomplete? Incomplete stories often indicate interruption. Something stopped mid-course. Something diverted rather than finished. In Arthur's case, the interruption appears not at the level of legend, but at the level of lineage. His story ends where others continue. His bloodline dissolves where others expand. That absence is not neutral. It creates a vacuum. And vacuums attract speculation. For centuries, that speculation was contained by lack of tools. But containment is no longer guaranteed. As modern scholarship increasingly crosses disciplinary boundaries, the old safeguards weaken. A historian may dismiss folklore. A geneticist may dismiss legend. But when data begins to echo story, and story begins to align with data, dismissal becomes harder. This convergence does not produce certainty. It produces unease. Unease is the hallmark of destabilizing truth. Not because it is proven, but because it refuses to remain abstract. Arthur's lineage, whether literal or symbolic, now occupies a space where it cannot be fully denied, yet cannot be comfortably affirmed. It hovers between possibility and implication. And implications matter more than conclusions. If a sacred lineage existed outside institutional control, even in diluted form, it challenges foundational assumptions. It suggests that legitimacy may precede authority, that power can emerge organically, without sanction, that history's most enduring influences may be those least visible. This is precisely the kind of idea institutions have always feared. Not rebellion, but reorientation. Not overthrow, but reconsideration. The Templars understood this danger intimately. Their mistake was not secrecy, but concentration. They held knowledge too tightly, too visibly. They became an institution around something that could not survive institutionalization. A lineage can dissolve into obscurity. An order cannot. When pressure mounted, the order broke. The knowledge dispersed. Arthur's lineage, if it survived, learned the opposite lesson. Never centralize. Never announce, never claim. Become untraceable not through disappearance, but through ubiquity. In this light, Arthur's role shifts once again. He is no longer simply ancestor or symbol. He becomes origin point. A convergence where older sacred kingship met emerging historical reality. A moment when lineage, myth, and political necessity collided, and something had to give. What gave was visibility. Everything else adapted. This adaptation explains the strange calm surrounding Arthur compared to other contested figures. There is no violent dispute over his descendants. No crusade to prove or disprove his bloodline. Instead, there is silence, polite avoidance, scholarly caution, as though the subject itself carries an unspoken boundary. Boundaries often protect something fragile. The question then is not whether Arthur's lineage survived in a way recognizable to medieval chroniclers. It is whether its survival altered the trajectory of memory itself. Whether it taught Britain how to remember without declaring, how to honor without exposing, how to preserve without proclaiming. This kind of legacy does not end. It shifts contexts. In the modern era, where identity is increasingly individual rather than dynastic, the idea of a sacred lineage becomes less about power and more about meaning. Not who rules, but who belongs. Not who commands, but who carries memory forward. Arthur's bloodline, if diffused, may now exist not as authority, but as inheritance of responsibility. An inherited awareness that some things are not meant to dominate, only to endure. That balance matters more than victory. That legitimacy rooted in origin must coexist with humility to survive. This may explain why Arthur remains compelling even when stripped of grandeur. When portrayed as flawed, wounded, mortal, he becomes more powerful, not less. Because he feels human. And human origins resonate more deeply than divine appointments. As history continues to loosen its edits, the story does not rush toward revelation. It moves toward recognition. Recognition that myth and history are not opposites, but collaborators. That legend can preserve what record cannot. That silence can be intentional rather than empty. Arthur's name persists because it marks a threshold between old world and new, between sacred kingship and institutional rule, between bloodline and belief. That threshold was never meant to be crossed fully, only guarded. And perhaps that is the final inheritance of Arthur's lineage, not a throne reclaimed, not a truth exposed, but a boundary is maintained. A reminder that some origins are too foundational to be owned and too disruptive to be erased. The veil continues to thin, not because secrets demand exposure, but because understanding demands maturity. The modern world may finally be approaching the point where it can look at such a lineage without needing to control it, deny it, or weaponize it. If so, the story does not end in revelation. It ends in acceptance. Acceptance that history is layered, that some lines were hidden not out of malice, but necessity. That survival sometimes requires becoming myth. And in that sense, Arthur was never lost. He was preserved exactly where he needed to be. Preservation through myth is not an ending. It is a holding pattern, a way for something too volatile to remain intact until the conditions around it change. Myths are not lies in this sense. They are containers. They keep meaning alive when direct expression would lead to destruction. And if Arthur's lineage entered myth not as fiction, but as refuge, then its survival depended on the world eventually becoming capable of bearing it. That capacity has always been uneven. Even now, history struggles with ideas that unsettle authority without offering replacement. A sacred lineage outside institutional control does exactly that. It does not seek to rule, yet it undermines the logic by which ruling has been justified. It asks uncomfortable questions, not about who should lead, but why leadership is believed to require permission at all. For centuries, that question was unaskable. Power answered itself. Kings ruled because God willed it. Churches spoke because they were ordained to speak. Lineage mattered only when sanctioned. Anything else was heresy or treason. In such a world, Arthur's bloodline, if it existed beyond approval, could only survive by becoming inaudible. But inaudible does not mean inert. Across the long arc of British history, certain values recur with remarkable persistence. Suspicion of absolute authority, preference for customary law over imposed decree, reverence for place rather than office. These tendencies are often explained politically or culturally, yet they align uncannily with the values encoded in early Arthurian material. Kingship as service, authority as conditional, power as temporary stewardship rather than permanent right. These ideas are not convenient for empire. They do not support centralization. They resist dogma, and yet they endure. Not because they are enforced, but because they resonate. Resonance is a form of inheritance. It does not require blood to be meaningful, but it often originates there. If Arthur's lineage became diffuse, it may have ceased to function biologically as a single identifiable line. But biologically diffuse lineages can still shape outcomes if their values persist culturally. In this way, Arthur's influence may have transitioned from genetics to ethos, from inheritance of blood to inheritance of principle. This would explain why Arthur's name is invoked most powerfully not in moments of domination, but in moments of crisis. When legitimacy is questioned, when authority fractures, when balance is threatened. He appears as reminder, not command, as measure, not master. The Templars may have understood this before anyone else. Their obsession with lineage was never simply about descent. It was about legitimacy without permission, about sacred authority that did not originate in Rome or crown. They feared it, they revered it, and ultimately, they could not control it. Control was their undoing. Arthur's lineage, by contrast, survived precisely because it avoided control. It allowed itself to become unclear, to be mistaken for story, to be archived as romance, to be shelved as fiction. In doing so, it passed beneath the notice of institutions designed to eliminate threats. This strategy is not unique in history. Other suppressed traditions followed similar paths. Indigenous spiritual systems disguised themselves as folklore. Banned philosophies survived as allegory. Forbidden sciences persisted as craft. What survives is not always what is defended most aggressively, but what adapts most quietly. Arthur's story adapted perfectly. Yet adaptation carries a cost. When something hides too well, it risks being forgotten entirely. The balance between concealment and remembrance is delicate. Too much silence, and continuity breaks. Too much exposure, and destruction follows. Arthur's myth walked this line for centuries, aided by poets, storytellers, and chroniclers who may not have understood what they preserved, but preserved it nonetheless. This is why the resurgence of interest in Arthur now feels different. It is not driven by nationalism or romance alone. It is driven by unease, by a sense that something foundational has been miscategorized, that history's filing system is flawed. Modern inquiry is not interested in restoring kings. It is interested in understanding origins. And origins are dangerous because they precede justification. They undermine narratives built later to explain power. Arthur's bloodline, if real, matters less as a claim than as a challenge. A challenge to the idea that legitimacy must be granted rather than inherited. A challenge to the belief that authority flows only from institutions. A challenge to the notion that myth is opposed to truth. This is why resistance remains, not overt, but subtle. The topic is still treated cautiously, still framed as speculative, still compartmentalized. Scholars speak around it rather than through it. Because to speak plainly would require acknowledging that history has blind spots by design. Blind spots protect systems. Removing them destabilizes confidence. Yet destabilization is not inherently destructive. It can be clarifying. It can restore complexity where simplicity was imposed. It can return agency to narratives stripped of it. Arthur's lineage, if it existed, would represent such a restoration. Not a call to belief, but a call to reconsideration. To ask whether the medieval world hid this truth because it was false, or because it was too true to manage. The Templars' fate suggests the latter was possible. Their destruction followed a familiar pattern. First suspicion, then accusation, then elimination. Finally, narrative control. Once gone, they were recast as greedy, heretical, deluded. The possibility that they guarded something meaningful was dismissed as conspiracy. History moved on. Arthur avoided this fate by never becoming an institution. He could not be tried. He could not be burned. He could not be disbanded. He existed only as story. And story, unlike order, cannot be executed. That may be the most profound lesson of this entire lineage. Survival sometimes requires surrendering form. As we move further into the present, the question shifts again. Not whether Arthur's bloodline existed, but what it means if it did. What responsibility comes with recognizing such a lineage? What changes when legitimacy is no longer exclusive? These are not medieval questions, they are modern ones. In a world grappling with identity, authority, and belonging, the idea that legitimacy can be inherited outside institutions is unsettling. But it is also liberating. It suggests that meaning does not require permission, that history is not closed, that some truths persist not because they are proclaimed, but because they are lived. Arthur's lineage, if it survived, may no longer exist as a family. It may exist as a pattern of restraint, a memory of balance, a warning against absolutism, a reminder that power without humility collapses. The Templars failed because they tried to hold the truth. Arthur's lineage endured because it let the truth move. And now, as technology strips away the final layers of enforced silence, the story does not rush toward exposure. It waits. Because the danger was never discovery. It was misuse. The world is only now approaching the point where such knowledge might be encountered without being weaponized, where a lineage could be understood without being exploited, where history could be revised without being replaced by another myth. If that moment arrives, Arthur's story will not demand belief. It will demand maturity. And maturity is rare. The veil continues to thin. Not because secrets want to escape, but because humanity is slowly learning how to look without grasping. What remains to be seen is whether we are finally capable of hearing the story without trying to own it. What follows after restraint is reckoning. Not the dramatic reckoning of trial or revelation, but the quieter reckoning that occurs when a culture begins to sense that something it long dismissed may never have been empty at all. This is where Arthur's story now sits. Not at the center of belief, but at the edge of re-evaluation. No longer protected by obscurity, yet not exposed enough to be resolved. The modern world prides itself on transparency, but transparency is selective. We illuminate what fits our frameworks and overlook what does not. Arthur's lineage, if it existed, belongs to that second category. It does not fit neatly into genetics alone, nor into history alone, nor into myth alone. It sits between disciplines, and things that sit between disciplines are often neglected not because they lack evidence, but because they resist ownership. Ownership has always been the real issue. Kings claimed authority by owning lineage. Churches claimed authority by owning interpretation. Institutions survive by defining boundaries. A sacred lineage that cannot be owned destabilizes all three. It answers to no charter, no crown, no doctrine. It cannot be granted or revoked. It simply is. And this is why it remains so unsettling even now. In recent decades, historians have begun to notice a pattern in how Arthurian material is treated compared to other legendary figures. Where other myths are aggressively debunked or confidently contextualized, Arthur is handled with caution. His historicity is neither fully denied nor fully affirmed. His genealogy is acknowledged as problematic, then set aside. His absence of heirs is noted, then politely ignored. This is not how scholars usually behave when evidence is weak. It is how they behave when evidence is uncomfortable. Discomfort signals pressure. Pressure builds when too many anomalies align. when burial practices do not match doctrine, when settlement continuity defies conquest narratives, when symbols recur where they should not, when silence itself becomes patterned. These signals do not demand belief, but they demand explanation. And explanations that rely on coincidence grow weaker with repetition. Arthur's story has repeated itself for over a millennium, not in detail, but in structure. Emergence during collapse, authority without institution, withdrawal rather than consolidation, absence of heirs, transformation into myth. Each of these elements, taken alone, can be dismissed. Together, they form a coherent arc, one that mirrors the survival strategies of lineages and traditions that learned too early that visibility invites extinction. This arc becomes even clearer when contrasted with what happened to those who did not hide. The Merovingians asserted sacred descent and were erased. The Templars accumulated guardianship and were annihilated. Both confronted authority directly. Arthur's lineage, if it existed, did not. It dissolved instead of resisting. It yielded form while preserving essence. Essence is harder to destroy. The modern question, then, is not whether Arthur had descendants, but whether the idea of descent itself was deliberately redefined. Instead of inheritance as power, inheritance as memory. Instead of succession as rule, succession as continuity. A lineage that survives not by claiming authority, but by refusing it. This reframes the meaning of sacred blood. Not divine right to rule, but divine obligation to endure, to protect balance, to resist absolutism, to withdraw when domination becomes inevitable. These themes align disturbingly well with early descriptions of Arthur that predate romance. A leader who appears when needed, who restores order briefly, who does not establish an empire, who leaves before consolidation corrupts purpose. This is not the behavior of a conqueror, it is the behavior of a custodian. Custodians do not seek recognition, they seek survival of what they guard. If Arthur's lineage adopted this posture, then its greatest success was becoming irrelevant to those who measured relevance through power. It ceased to matter to kings. It ceased to matter to churches. It ceased to matter to institutions. And in doing so, it survived all of them. This survival has consequences. A lineage that persists invisibly becomes part of the population rather than above it. Its values diffuse, its memory fragments, its influence becomes ambient rather than directive. Over time, what remains is not identity, but tendency. Cultural reflexes that seem to arise organically, but trace back to older constraints. Britain's long discomfort with absolute authority. Its persistent emphasis on custom over decree. Its reverence for unwritten law. Its suspicion of centralized power. These traits are often explained pragmatically, yet they echo Arthurian principles with remarkable consistency. Authority constrained. Power shared. Kings bound. If these ideas originated not as philosophy, but as survival logic embedded by a lineage that learned the cost of visibility, then their persistence is no accident. They are inheritance without inheritance. The Templars may have recognized this too late. They attempted to formalize guardianship. They tried to hold what was never meant to be held. Their archives, their symbols, their secrecy were all too concentrated, too legible, too threatening. When pressure came, they shattered. Arthur's lineage avoided that fate by becoming illegible. Illegibility is survival. Now, however, we face a paradox. Modern tools are designed to eliminate illegibility, to make patterns visible, to surface what was hidden, to connect fragments. The very strategies that allowed a lineage to endure now place it at risk of reassembly. This is why the current moment feels precarious. Digital imaging exposes erased names. Genetics reveals unexpected continuity. Archaeology anchors legend to place. Each discipline alone is harmless. Together, they create coherence. And coherence invites interpretation. Interpretation invites narrative. Narrative invites an appropriation. Appropriation is what the medieval world feared most. If Arthur's lineage is reconstructed as a claim rather than a condition, it becomes dangerous again. Not because it threatens thrones, but because it tempts belief. And belief, when untethered from restraint, seeks expression. Expression seeks validation. Validation seeks power. This is why the story resists conclusion. There is an ethical dimension here rarely acknowledged. Some truths, even if real, require maturity rather than exposure. The difference between understanding and exploitation is thin. The medieval world lacked that maturity. It destroyed what it could not control. The modern world may destroy by commodifying instead. Arthur's lineage, if it survived, would now face a different threat. Not erasure, but consumption. Turned into spectacle. Claimed by ideology. Reduced to identity politics or nationalist fantasy. This would be another form of destruction. Quieter, but no less complete. Perhaps this is why the story still moves slowly. Why it reveals itself in fragments. Why certainty remains elusive. Why every advance is accompanied by restraint. It is not simply that evidence is incomplete. It may be that the story itself has learned to resist acceleration. Some histories cannot be rushed without being damaged. Arthur's story has waited centuries. It can wait longer. What matters is not whether the lineage is proven, but whether it is understood correctly, if it is. Understood not as entitlement, but as warning. Not as authority, but as memory. Not as destiny, but as responsibility. Responsibility to remember that power without humility destroys itself. That legitimacy without restraint collapses. That survival sometimes demands invisibility. If Arthur's bloodline exists today, it likely exists unknowingly. Scattered. Unremarkable. Unclaimed. And that may be exactly why it endures. The story does not move toward a crown reclaimed or a truth unveiled. It moves toward a reckoning with how history is handled, with whether we are capable of encountering foundational ambiguity without needing to resolve it into hierarchy. That capacity will determine what happens next, because the final danger was never that Arthur's lineage would return. It was that we would not know what to do if it did. What comes after that realization is not discovery, but restraint tested. When a culture reaches the edge of something it once feared, the real question is not whether it can uncover it, but whether it can leave it intact. Arthur's lineage, if it survived at all, has endured precisely because it was never asked to perform, never forced to justify itself, never required to prove its right to exist. The moment it becomes an object of proof, it risks becoming an object of power. And power, historically, has never handled sacred inheritance gently. This is why the modern moment feels so delicate. For the first time, the tools exist to reconstruct what was once deliberately scattered. Names can be cross-referenced, landscapes can be scanned, manuscripts can be peeled back layer by layer, genetic markers can be traced across centuries. The temptation is to assemble these fragments into a single, coherent narrative. To say, this is the line, here it is, now known. But coherence is exactly what earlier ages tried to destroy. Arthur's story survived because it remained incomplete, because it could not be pinned down to a single place, a single family, a single claim. Its power lay in ambiguity, in being present everywhere and nowhere at once, in shaping identity without dictating hierarchy. If the lineage is forced back into coherence, it risks repeating the very cycle that erased others before it. This is where the comparison with the Moravians and the Templars becomes most instructive. Both were destroyed not because they lacked truth, but because their truth was too legible. too concentrated, too threatening, once articulated clearly. Their error was not belief, but exposure. Arthur's lineage, by contrast, if it existed, learned to remain unreadable. Unreadability is not ignorance, it is defense. There is a tendency in modern thought to equate truth with disclosure, to believe that something only has value once it is fully visible. But history suggests the opposite is sometimes true. Some truths survive only when partially hidden, not to deceive, but to protect, not from knowledge, but from misuse. Arthur's bloodline, whether literal or symbolic, sits squarely in this category. Its significance does not lie in who could claim it, but in what it represents. A form of legitimacy that does not depend on recognition. A reminder that origin can exist without authority. That inheritance can exist without entitlement. This idea runs counter to nearly every political system humanity has built, and yet it persists. Perhaps this persistence explains why attempts to modernize Arthur's story always fall short. Each adaptation tries to pin him down. As hero, as tyrant, as saint, as myth. None endure. The story resists final definition because definition is not its purpose. Arthur is not meant to be resolved. He is meant to remain liminal. Liminal figures guard thresholds. They exist between states, between worlds. Arthur stands between pagan and Christian, between myth and history, between bloodline and belief. His lineage, if it survived, would occupy that same in-between space. Never fully sacred, never fully secular, never fully political, never fully erased. This in-between status is uncomfortable. It offers no slogans, no claims, no easy conclusions, but it offers something else. Perspective. Perspective is dangerous to power. It reminds rulers that authority is temporary. Institutions that legitimacy is constructed. Narratives that they are curated. Arthur's endurance may not be about ancestry at all, but about memory of limits. The medieval world suppressed sacred lineages because they threatened control. The modern world risks reviving them because it mistakes complexity for opportunity. Both impulses miss the point. If Arthur's lineage survived, its greatest legacy may not be who it produced, but what it prevented. The rise of absolute kingship. The collapse into singular authority. The erasure of older balances. Its influence may be measured not in events that happened, but in extremes that did not. This is almost impossible to prove, and that may be intentional. History tends to celebrate disruption. It records wars, coronations, revolutions. It rarely records restraint. It has no category for paths not taken. Yet restraint shapes outcomes just as powerfully as action, sometimes more so. Arthur's story, read this way, becomes a meditation on restraint. A lineage that chose survival over dominance. Silence over proclamation. Diffusion over consolidation. It did not conquer history, it flowed through it. The Templars tried to stand between history and truth, and were crushed. Arthur's lineage, if it existed, stepped aside and endured. Now the burden shifts. The question is no longer whether such a lineage could have survived. The question is whether we can encounter the possibility of it without repeating the old mistakes, without turning ambiguity into ideology, without turning inheritance into entitlement, without turning memory into weapon. This is not a historical challenge. It is an ethical one. Modern scholarship prides itself on objectivity, yet it is not immune to desire. The desire to be first, to reveal, to name, to claim discovery. Arthur's story tempts that desire precisely because it has resisted it for so long. The longer something remains unresolved, the stronger the impulse to resolve it. But resolution is not always wisdom. If Arthur's lineage endured by becoming invisible, then visibility is not its reward. Understanding is. understanding that some histories were hidden not to deceive the future, but to protect it. Understanding that legitimacy rooted in origin does not grant authority to rule, only responsibility to remember. Understanding that myth can be a vessel of care rather than a mask of falsehood. The final danger is not that Arthur's lineage will be proven or disproven, it is that it will be misunderstood. Misunderstanding would turn a lesson into a slogan, a warning into a banner, a memory into a myth once again, but this time emptied of its restraint. Perhaps this is why the story continues to unfold slowly, why each advance is partial, why certainty remains just out of reach, why the veil lifts but never fully. The story is not waiting for evidence, it is waiting for readiness. Readiness to accept that not all truths are meant to empower, some are meant to humble. Arthur's name still carries weight because it points to something humanity struggles to hold. Authority without domination, inheritance without entitlement, memory without control. Whether his bloodline survives is, in the end, less important than whether we can hear what his story has been trying to teach us for centuries. The past is not asking to be conquered. It is asking to be understood.